What cars did the celebrities of the USSR and the first years of New Russia drive? So let's go. And probably, almost all of my viewers know that in the days of the USSR it was simply impossible for a mere mortal to get an expensive stamp for a mere mortal, that even stars of the scale of the USSR could do it in very rare cases. For example, the wife of the great actor Andrei Mironov in 1985 had to literally knock out the coveted permission to buy and mark in. Andrei's wife Larisa went to the Ministry of Trade and began to persuade the local chief to allow Miron to purchase a Mercedes that was at the disposal of the heads of the trade. It was almost possible to do this, but somehow the coveted car went to one high-ranking military lawyer. Ultimately, Larisa's efforts were not in vain. I still managed to drink Mark's wine. So Andrei Mironov became the proud owner of a car. There was very little information on the network about what kind of model it was, but, according to the recollections of one eyewitness, it was possible to establish that, most likely, it was probably in this series in the back for 30, and then, by the way, the last model of another famous Soviet actor, Vladimir Vysotsky, was a real gourmet offer. And his third wife, the French actress of Russian origin Marina Vlogi, who became Vladimir's wife in 1917, helped his third wife to get rarely land cars. The brand became a relatively unpretentious 16-ek with a motor volume of 1.60 liters and 83 horsepower. By the way, Vlogi herself brought 16 new countries to the USSR and, as she said, bought this car with soap bubbles, that is, she starred in an advertisement, some kind of soap, and received $3,000 for it. In 1974, the star of the Soviet television screen began to master the technique more seriously from France. A tall one brought a bright blue sedan 2500, which, by the way, are the predecessors of the first 7 in the 23rd body. Under its hood lurked a pleasant 6 with volumes of 2.5 liters and a capacity of 150 horsepower. With such a recoil, a large sedan could accelerate on the highway to 195 km per hour, change the first 100 in less than 11 seconds, that is, almost twice as fast as the Denin. It is curious that Vladimir had another second, exactly the same, only beige, which he bought in commission. Already in 1976 a year, the actor acquires a luxurious Mercedes 116 in the Ministry of Finance. There is a lot of controversy on the internet about which model was found by Meatsaid, apparently confirming that it was a Model 350. The exit from the manual gearbox explained that under its hood was hidden an 8-cylinder engine with a liter capacity of horsepower. This output was enough to develop a speed of 205 km per hour on the highway and exchange the first 100 in 9.5 seconds through the eyes of a citizen of the USSR. It was almost a supercar. In this car, Vladimir, as they say, flew along the roads of that time and, unfortunately, crashed it on January 1, 1970 in his head at high speed to ram a tram. And finally, completing the topic of the high, it is worth mentioning that Vladimir owned another Mercedes almost simultaneously from above. It is not known exactly, but most likely it was a model of 450 males of 170 universities. This snippet was generated in Yandex Cloud. The actor was really proud of this car. I understand why the car in 1979 a year was bought from a friend of Vladimir, a wealthy German citizen of Irish descent. For some reason, many people think that it was relatives who sat on the old chronicles. I made out exactly the dating of the sanctions. Version 450. The model had manufacturers of 220 strong 8x4.5 meters. A stepped automatic without a B-pillar exchange the first 100 in just 8.8 of a second. Naturally, the traffic light at the races in the then Moscow Zaporozhets by biologists with acorns, the car, as they say, flew to the point. The famous driver took off on a level with some stuck Muscovites, and then the passengers of the German car heard an ironic phrase from its owners, soaring off and immediately leaving the horizon. Another Soviet and Russian actor, Alexander Yushakov, of course, is not as famous as Tol and Mironov. The cars he owns are even more interesting. He began his automotive life as a simple Volkswagen 1600 variant, which was bought in the 70s. A rather ordinary European car at the time in the USSR was exotic, but Yushakov's second car cannot be called An ordinary one, having bought the 126th body of 1980 year of release, appeared at the actor in the early 90s, and without the fact that the roots of the varieties were developed, as Alexander himself said, by the German company Center. Unfortunately, I do not know such an office, but I dare to assume that this journalist is a typo. The processing was carried out by the famous Tender company, famous for its space with columns and responsibly German farmers installed on the machine, the so-called without their freedom, worked on the suspension and braking system, and also, according to Lonchakov, increased the volume of the engine to 6 liters, that is, the power of 8 passed far beyond 300 horsepower. Acceleration to 100 km per hour, most likely, took less than 6 seconds. And finally, the most interesting thing is that this car lit up the films of the cross that have been worn since 1995. They are the main characters. Yushakov quite effectively pursued the villains for 123. But now let's return again to an earlier period in the history of our motherland and again look at the tendency of USSR stars to acquire stamps as well. The well-known director and actor Nikita Mikhail Kotov did not have such a gorgeous car fleet at the time of Vysotsky. But nevertheless, in 1979 a year, he became the happy owner of 115,970 years of issue with number 20. It was the very last Mercedes with vertical headlights. Unfortunately, I do not know the model of this car. I can say for sure if it was 115, the body on it definitely did not stand. In line 6. Such engines were installed on the 114th body, the differences of which lay in the motors, equipment, decorative elements of the exterior. Father Nikita, children's writer Sergei Malkov, also followed his son's example and in 1980 a year acquired and, based on the model index, it becomes clear that the car was first a Smart 6 110, 2 camshafts and a salt coordinator with a capacity of 160 horsepower. With such a motor, the car could reach a speed of 190 km per hour and accelerate to 111.5 of a second, taking into account the manual transmission. In general, the years were such a subject of desire of our stars in 1986 a year. The list of star owners of this brand also includes a woman who sings. It was this year that Alla Pugacheva bought herself a Mercedes 237 months of the year of release. Such cars are now living out their days, but then it was the real embodiment of a chic business sedan. Pugachev had a legendary 123rd body, famous for its reliability. Under his hood was still an old acquaintance of 115 body, 115 motor. The return of the entire unit with the operator of the country reached 109 horsepower. With such power under the hood, Alla Borisovna could, in her own person, somewhere, we can accelerate to 170 km per hour and overcome the first 100 in 13.7 of a second. However, the second indicator did not stand out much against the background of the 8th model of the Lada, but, naturally in terms of smoothness and legendary comfort, 123rd was settled like a walk to the moon, and in the second half of the 80s there was Mercedes, and there was perhaps a lazy celebrity. The 123rd, a more modest version, 200, was ridden by the gift of Ryazanov Joseph as his own, and known to me, model 124th, as, incidentally, Gennady Kazanov and others. It was only Yuri Antonov who stood out among them, who in the 84th year took and bought himself a new one more than 244 plus and stood out with a license plate 244th represented itself as a rather large sedan, in size even exceeded 123rd is unknown only with such an engine was a car Antonov. Our celebrities of those years drove such interesting and not so interesting cars. Well, if you liked this issue, then I ask you to express it in the form of likes, comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel.